All right, everybody, welcome back to our third session of the third of the third for the Art of the Sword Zoom conference here, all about swords. I'm really pleased to have the next speaker come in. I'll have him introduce himself a little bit, but James Hester is a specialist in arms and armor and historical combat. He has worked at places as an educator at the Higgins Armory Museum when it was in Massachusetts. And he has most recently worked as a curator of arms and armor at the Royal Armories collection. So it's great to have you here today, James.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, no, it's a pleasure. It's always, you never have to ask me too stringently to sit and nerd about swords for a while. So I think what I'll do is I'll wade right in. So just to give a little bit of context of what I'm talking about today. So from 2015 to 2018, I was doing my PhD at the University of Southampton here in the UK, looking at the use of late medieval edged weapons, so swords, daggers, and staff weapons, by doing a deep dive into all of the sources that we had at our disposal to study these. So that's obviously the fencing treatises that have survived from this period. That is the existing specimens of arms and armor, depictions of combat in late medieval artwork, and where we have them, specimens of skeletal remains that show signs of sharp force trauma. And so what I wanted to do is I looked at all of this information. I gathered as many specimens of all these different source groups as possible, and I tried to answer three questions. One, do each of these separate source groups tell a consistent story about the use of these weapons? Do they more or less match up? Two, do those non-treatise sources, the arms and armor, the art, and the skeletons, match up with what we're seeing depicted and taught in the fencing treatises? And then finally, having all of this evidence and analyzing it, is it possible to point to certain techniques and principles that are expounded in the fencing treatises and say that it's possible to make a reasonably strong case using the evidence that techniques like those were in fact appreciated, understood, and practiced beyond just the mind of that master and perhaps their small circle of students? You know, to what extent is what's going on in the manuals an intellectual exercise compared to what you would actually use to defend your life if when the chips are down? So that's a massive sprawling project, which is why it took 3 years and almost 100,000 words. So it's impossible for me to touch on all that today. Hopefully that's going to become published. My thesis is, I'm in talks at the moment, so watch this space. I'll make announcements about that. But it's proceeding at speed of publication combined with speed of pandemic. So what I'm going to talk about today is one slice of all of that investigation, which was the instances of damage on existing medieval swords that appears to be consistent with use in combat. Now, I should probably set my parameters. When I say late medieval, the time period that I worked with is roughly between about 1350 through to about 1500. Mainly because that's the period where we have a very substantial body of fencing treatises that we can use as control group. There's plenty of arms and armor and other source material from that. I didn't want to go any earlier than that because then we start going out of the bounds of what we can compare with fencing treatises. So, throat clearing done. I'm going to attempt technology, so stand back. I'm going to try to share my screen for the presentation. Okay, click present mode. Is that coming through clear?
It is, yes.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So, as I said, today we're going to talk just about the instances of damage on late medieval swords that I uncovered. So a little bit about how I went about gathering this information, how I ended up organizing and analyzing it, and some of the things, interesting things that I found from studying these. So first off, what do I mean by swords? So I looked at three main types of sword, and these are the three most common that we see in use during the period that we're dealing with here. So you have the shorter, single-handed, double-edged style of sword, frequently referred to as an arming sword. You have the longer variety made for use in two hands, although they're usually weighted so that you can use them comfortably in one. And these go by many names. I tend to refer to them as long swords. They're also referred to as names like hand and a half sword, bastard sword. In the period that we're dealing with, you sometimes hear them referred to as two-hand swords. This is before we get to the 16th century, where that term comes to refer to the much, much larger versions. And then finally, the single-edged, sometimes curved, sometimes not style of sword that again goes by many names. You hear these alternately referred to as falchions, messers, storta, hangers. They go by a bunch of different names depending on where you are. So for the purposes of ease, I took all of those different types of weapons and I lumped them under the general working term falchion. So when I refer to falchion, I'm referring to everything that more or less conforms to those features: single-edged with a reinforced blunted spine, sometimes curved, sometimes not. First, we must have the naming of parts, just so we're all on the same page in terms of some of the terminology that I'll be mentioning. Generally speaking, sword has two main parts. You have the hilt, which is the grabby bit, and the blade, which is the cutty stabby bit, to use the technical terms. The hilt is divided into the grip that you hold, the pommel, the counterbalance to the blade, and the protrudences that are usually referred to either as guards or quillons. And then the blade, depending on who you ask, is divided typically into 2 or 3 sections. The part closest to the hilt is typically referred to, at least in the English translation of these words, as the strong. The upper third is typically referred to as the weak. And then some fencing masters identify a distinct middle for other purposes. Others do away with that and simply divide it into just the strong and the weak. So quick crash course in sword parts, just so everyone's on the same page when I start rattling off some of these as we go along. So what did I do to gather all this information? First off, I had to reach out and arrange to visit as many of the great collections of arms and armor as possible. Oh, the hardship. This was basically the first 2 years of my PhD research, getting to trot around all of these amazing collections all around Europe and parts of the US, getting to pull things out of stores and out of cases and poke them for science. It was absolutely amazing. Really, if you ever get the opportunity to handle original objects, do not pass it up. It is an experience. So I first examined every possible, well, we'll talk about swords for today. So every possible sword that fit the parameters of what I was looking for, the type of swords, the time period, and the region that I was focusing on. So that's mainly what we would consider Central, Western, and Northern Europe. So once I identified all the potentials for my shortlist, I then did a spot check on all of them to see if I found any signs of potential wear or damage like what I was looking for. If I did, then I would document them, do a full record sheet with all of their specs and measurements. I would include any records held from the collection itself. And then each individual instance of damage would be recorded as far as where on the blade, where on the weapon it was, shape, other features, and each was photo documented as well with a camera on a microscope function, because a lot of times these damages are very, very small, like sometimes millimeters at best. So I needed something very high resolution to actually record them properly. Then once that was done, I would make a very rough mumble scale drawing of the weapon and map the damage points. You can see it here, the drawing at the bottom as an example of that. So all the little specks in red that are numbered are individual damage points on the weapon, and these are given in more detail in the actual object's record. And then for reference, the blue line closer to the hilt on the blade is the weapon's center of balance. Very often I was able to determine this. And further up the blade, the purple line, where I was permitted to be able to determine this measurement, this is the rough approximate area of what we might call the center of percussion. And I'll get into that a little more later on. So trying to do something like this with weapons that are centuries old and have passed through many, many hands and have weathered the slings and arrows of time and neglect is not without its challenges. There are two main ones that we have to factor in when we're trying to look at original medieval swords for this type of damage. First is it possible to distinguish damage from use from damage that's just the result of gradual decay or damage from neglect, something that was dropped or otherwise bashed about at some point, either in its working life or later. Now, thankfully, this turned out to be, for the most part, relatively easy to accomplish because there's a fantastic example that you'll see here on screen. Generally speaking, the instances of damage that I was looking for was very geometrically distinct compared to the much more chaotic pattern of wear that you'd normally associate with decay. So usually it was fairly simple to be able to tell these apart. However, it's worth noting that I was incredibly conservative when I was documenting these objects, where if there was any doubt as to whether or not what I was looking at was possible use damage compared to neglect or decay, I opted to ignore it rather than possibly taint the data pool with improper information. So it's not impossible that on quite a lot of the objects that I was examining, there are instances of damage that were not documented because they weren't so obvious as to take notice. The other challenge is how to tell damage that is the result of use during this weapon's actual medieval working life compared to damage that was the result of mishandling or intentional recreational use, shall we say, by a later collector. I'm looking at you, Victorians. The gentleman to your right in the photo here, he's not quite a Victorian. This is the late John Woodman Higgins, the founder of the sadly no longer Higgins Armory Museum, which was my first museum gig, was something of a early 20th century arms and armor nerd and very avid collector. And as you can see here, tended to get quite up close and personal with his collection. It's worth noting for those of you who have an eye for armor that when he took this photo, he was so excited about this very nice Maximilian harness. He wanted to get photographed in it. He put the pauldrons on backwards. But this just gives you a really good example as to the kind of people who had these objects at one point or another in private collections and sometimes were guilty of playing a bit fast and loose with them. It's not uncommon for us to hear stories of early collectors taking medieval weapons and having a bit of a bash about with them with their mates. So how is it possible to tell damage that is medieval and original from this later usage? Unfortunately, the short answer is there isn't really a way. To date, there is no technology which allows us to reliably date damage and indentations on metals. So unfortunately, we have to come up with all sorts of other ways to try to weed out this possible later damage. So I went about this in a couple ways. First off, I tried to create a control group of weapons. Now, these are weapons who there's something about their provenance that would reduce the likelihood of them having been tampered with in more recent time. So this is either, these are either weapons that are in far too an advanced state of decay for very rigorous use to be a practical option. So some of these excavated weapons that are quite fragile, so there's no way you'd want to swing it around because it would just disintegrate. And also certain weapons that have been stored in places that the likelihood of them having been tampered with is much lower. There are around the world certain surviving early arsenals that are still intact. So you have, for example, the Civic arsenal in Vienna, which has been in use since at least the 15th century and is still a complete collection. You also have another group of weapons that I investigated were what are known as the Alexandria group of swords. These are a group of European swords that at one point were in the Hall of Victories in Alexandria and then later in Istanbul. And these were displayed as trophies by the Ottomans from their engagements with European forces. So these are weapons that at one point or another were either captured or otherwise acquired within the 14th and 15th century, placed here as trophy pieces and essentially not touched, in some cases even up until today. A lot of these are still in Turkey at places like the Topkapi Palace and at the military museum there. So these are places where the likelihood of some enthusiastic collector pulling it off the wall and having a bash about is far less likely. Still not impossible, but far less likely. So looking at those weapons, I compared the damage patterns on them to the rest to see if there were any noticeable differences. And thankfully, nothing really leapt out. So after looking at it this way, there was very, very little damage that I was compelled to eliminate as potentially suspect that I found. So we were able to proceed relatively confident that the damage that I documented is as likely as we're capable of getting to have been original working life damage as opposed to modern. So quickly to run down, you see a list here of these are the collections that I visited and drew for sources. So it's a number of very prominent arms collections, as well as a few private collections, individuals who were very good to let me into their private collections to look at some pieces that they have. So out of all of this, after looking at hundreds upon hundreds of swords, I was able to create a source pool of 59 swords. That's composed of 23 arming swords, 28 long swords, and 8 falchions. Now, when you figure that I spent 2 years looking at hundreds of swords, 59 seems like a rather small number, and it is. It's a frustratingly small number. Now, there's probably several reasons for this. One is that what we could be seeing here is a testament to weapons actually being fairly well maintained during their medieval working life, such that very noticeable damage would have either been repaired or obscured, or if a blade was damaged beyond repair, it would simply have been replaced. So we're perhaps less likely to see a large number of weapons that survive down to today with very significant damage on. Another option, which is kind of scary to think, is that we could be seeing the result of earlier, very, very aggressive conservation and preservation techniques by 18th and 19th century collectors and curators, whose approach to preserving these objects was perhaps far more intervention-based than we would think is permissible nowadays. I won't name names, but there is a very, very prominent early expert on swords who relates in one of his books a story where he was friends with the Dean of Westminster Abbey and was invited by the Dean to help him to clean the funerary sword over Henry V's tomb, and proceeded to sit in the pews with it and go at it with a bunch of wire wool. Obviously, this is something you wouldn't ever think of doing today, but at that time, trends were different and that was considered perfectly normal. So that's kind of what we're dealing with here, which could account for some of our damage being obscured or missing today. So out of all of that, I was able to identify damage that could be more or less grouped into 6 main types. The first I referred to as angle shifts. So these are instances where very, very abruptly, for a short period of the length of the blade, the geometry and the angle of the blade shifts off of its normal track, and then usually rights itself again after a little bit. Now, this is most likely to be the result of repeated sharpening, or more often grinding, in order to take off much more significant damage. So it's very likely that what we're seeing here is repair of more significant damage that we no longer can see. So even though we can't see what these angle shifts were done to cover up, they still can be useful to us because they'll tell us the parts of the weapon that, by virtue of having this repeated grinding done to the blade, were the most prone to abuse. So we can start to map out the bits of the weapon that were subjected to more excessive wear than others. The second type of damage are rolled edges. So this isn't so much a notch or a ding, but just a place where the otherwise even honed edge has been rolled one way or the other. So there's several types of things that could account for this. It's not impossible that this could be the result of, again, non-combative neglect. So we have to look at them very, very carefully and kind of see if there are any other details that might give more information. It could also be the result of the weapon, rather than striking another edge surface, striking a more blunted surface, and as a result, the edge was turned, whether that's a more blunted surface of another weapon, or armor, or possibly even hard matter on the person, bone. One could speculate, but hitting something that's hard enough with sufficient force to roll the edge, if it is at the right or perhaps wrong angle at the point of striking. Also, possibly the running of a sharpened or blunted surface along the blade with a great deal of speed and force might be enough to turn an edge very slightly if it's well honed. The third type of damage are outright breaks and repairs. Now, these are really quite rare. This one that you see depicted here is the most blatant one that I found. This is off of a early 15th century longsword in the collection of the Musée de l'Armée in Paris, where the top, I'd say maybe 3 or so inches, apparently snapped off and was actually repaired with a nice little join, which was welded. The weld has since faded away, so that bit's very, very fragile now. But it just shows, again, points of the weapon that were prone to significant abuse, obviously enough to even break portions of the blade off. But it's also very telling that very dramatic repairs like these were actually done, that a blade wasn't simply either thrown away after something like this, or perhaps reground to a shortened length or anything like that. So it's fascinating when you do see cases like this, because it shows just how much these blades were considered to be reparable and reusable even after very significant damage. Now, the next two groups of damage are by far the most common that we see. The fourth are triangular notches. These could either bite in more or less straight into the blade, or also be angling upwards or downwards. And these are almost certainly the result of direct edge-on-edge biting from one bladed surface into another, which left this kind of impression. And the angle of these, depending on which way it's facing, and sometimes other features, like if there's a rolled edge accompanying it, can at times give us some ability to interpret the possible trajectory of either this weapon or the incoming one at point of contact. It's not always possible, because there's so many variables about the way that a weapon can be held and the trajectory, the possible trajectories of the incoming weapon. You can't always get terribly exact with this, but in certain circumstances, you can limit down the possible numbers of scenarios which could have resulted in something like this. And the same can be said with the fifth group, which are rounded notches. So again, these are sometimes more or less straight in, and at times also angled upwards or downwards. They also tend to be divided into rounded notches that are rather smooth, or also quite jagged. Now, there's a number of possible interpretations for what's going on here when we see rounded notches. First and foremost, what we could be seeing is an attempted repair of a more dramatic notch, possibly something that bit into the blade a little more, such as a triangular notch, because it's not uncommon to round off through grinding a more dramatic notch, so as that doesn't become a weak spot that will allow added abuse and pressure in that spot to cause further damage over time. If you round it out and kind of go past where the final crack point was, you can actually get ahead of it and stabilize the blade in that spot. So for some of the more smooth notches, we could be seeing that. For the more jagged ones, this is one of the few areas where it's possible that we might have a pretty concrete interpretation as to what might be going on here in some circumstances. And as part of that, forming that interpretation, I have a fellow fencing enthusiast, teacher, and all-around sword nerd, Guy Windsor, to thank for his help with this. I was at his house while I was doing this research to talk about some of these things. And when I told him about these jagged round notches, he said, "I bet I know what does that. Come with me." And we went onto his courtyard, at which point he produced a pair of sharp machetes, handed me one of them, told me to deliver a downward cut to him, which I did gently, of course, because we're dealing with sharps, at which point he made rising contact with the blade, and in so doing, wound the blade very, very quickly. And when we looked at my machete afterwards, what we found was a nice little, slightly jagged, scooped out divot in the steel that looked remarkably like a lot of the equivalent ones that I was seeing on blades. So it's very possible that with some of these jagged, rounded notches, what we're seeing is not necessarily direct, hard blade-on-blade biting, but contact during which we might be seeing some kind of winding motion, which scooped out a little bit of steel during contact. But again, that's one of many, many possible interpretations. And the final type of damage are cuts or gouges. You don't normally see this to edges, because were this to happen to an edge, it would probably bite more like a triangular notch. You tend to see this type of damage more to hilt furniture, and in the very, very, very few instances where we find damage to the flat. And I'll get into that again, because that's a particular axe I like to grind. So now let's move on to some of the findings and a couple examples as well. So for arming swords, on the whole, the damage to these types of weapons was more or less limited to the upper and lower parts of the middle, or if you're dividing the blade just in two, to the upper parts of the strong and the lower parts of the weak. This is fairly consistent with the placement of blade-on-blade contact that we see depicted and sometimes articulated by masters in the fencing treatises. You see a lot of the images where there's points of contact, they're more or less using these parts exclusively for blade-on-blade contact. Strangely enough, on arming swords, there was very, very little damage to be found to the guards and the hilt furniture. So it's possible that you could interpret this as suggesting that with arming swords, the guard perhaps was less often engaged with or came into contact with the blade compared to other styles of sword. Most of the damage that we found was weighted towards one or the other of the two edges. And I'll get into this later, very frequently you do find damage on both edges. So for our example here, I wish I was able to get a better reference shot of this because this is a really fascinating piece. What we have here is a late 14th century Italian sword, probably made for Cypriot usage, because the pommel and some of the other features of the blade are not necessarily as common as typically Italian weapons, and is more consistent with some of the Cypriot and almost Byzantine kind of style features. Sadly, this is in a private collection, so I happen to know the dealer who was selling this, and he allowed me to come in and document it before it was whisked away. So unfortunately, unless you know who currently has it, it's probably going to be very difficult to access. And this is one of the aforementioned Alexandria group swords. So on this sword, you can't see it in the photo, is an Arabic inscription showing that this sword was deposited in the Hall of Victories in Alexandria in 1367. And rather than being a war trophy, this was probably part of a batch of swords that was gifted by the King of Cyprus to the Sultan after a failed attack on the city of Alexandria, which took place in 1365. So this was part of the peace process and smoothing things out afterwards. So as you can see, we've got a number of damage points here, again, on both edges, mainly triangular and rounded notches, but again, some shifting of the edge with some rolled edges as well. Again, as normal, as I mentioned before, mainly concentrated to the strong and the weak. So it's very, very likely that the damage that we're seeing towards the upper end near the weak is most likely the result of offensive actions that either struck an opposing weapon or met with some other kind of resistance, or perhaps in some circumstances actually did manage to meet their target. Whereas the damage to the lower end is most likely to be from defensive action. So either a bind or a parry of an incoming attack, or perhaps a combination of both, such as a bind of the opposing weapon while making an attack of one's own. Moving on to long swords. Long swords, there's a fairly even spread of damage throughout the blades. But again, they're more or less concentrated generally in the vicinity of the upper and lower, the strong and the weak. Again, this is rather consistent with what we see as far as discussions of how these are to be used in the fencing treatises. So it matches up fairly well. unlike the arming swords, we see a little more damage here on the guards. So possibly what we're seeing here is an indication that, unlike with arming swords, the guards came into a bit more contact with blades and other parts of opposing weapons compared to their smaller counterparts. Again, as before, most of the damage tends to be concentrated on one or the other edges. However, damage is usually found on both edges. The specimen we see here is a lovely late 15th century longsword of German make, housed in the Vienna Civic Armory. And this just really shows how astonishing the Civic Armory collection is, because we have on record that this sword was one of several objects that was deposited into the arsenal for general use and issue by a wealthy Viennese citizen in 1504. So this and several other swords and assorted bits were deposited there in 1504 and have not left and are still there altogether. So it's weapons like this that formed part of our control group because they've basically been in situ where they were deposited since during their working life. So they're really time capsules, and quite remarkable that that collections like these still survive. Moving on now to falchions. Excuse me. Most of the damage to falchions is again concentrated towards what could be regarded as the middle of the blade, but again, mostly towards the edges of the middle. So if we were dividing it into two again, it would more or less correspond to the inner parts, the upper part of the strong and the lower part of the weak. Most of the damage we see is concentrated on the primary cutting edge, the entirely sharpened one. However, you do see some damage to either the blunted back edge or where this is found, the portion of the back edge that is sharpened as well. Interestingly enough, out of the falchions that I examined, there was no damage to be found on the guards at all. Now, I'm reluctant to draw any conclusions about this because there were so few falchions that I was able to examine. It's not quite a significant enough group to make any leaps, so I'm going to pass on making any calls about that. And this falchion was probably one of the true joys of all of my handling exploits during the research. This is a late 15th century falchion in the National Museum in Copenhagen in Denmark. And what's remarkable about it, beyond just the fact that it's quite a beautiful weapon, the photo I have doesn't do it justice. This amazingly chiseled scalloped blade, gold work and inlaid ivory, both white and green on the hilt. It's quite a posh weapon, and it should be, because it was a wedding gift to a member of the Danish royal family by none other than the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I himself. So the fact that there's damage on a weapon like this at all is very interesting. One, because it tells you that even the really, really spangly, fancy, posh weapons were still very, very businesslike and were actually used. And it's very tempting to speculate whether this damage was the result of use by that Danish royal or one of his ancestors, or possibly, if this was a personal possession of Max himself, possibly could have been the result of use by the man himself before it was gifted. Unfortunately, we'll never know, but it's, of course, very tempting to speculate. But again, this is very significant because it shows that we're dealing with a very high status weapon here. So clearly something in the possession of someone who would have had access to the very specialized training that we tend to see depicted in the fencing treatises, as opposed to much more intuitive, what tends to be called common fencing. So it's an interesting one to compare the others to, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So in addition to finding out some interesting insights about the individual types of swords, it became possible as the research went on to make a pretty solid case for some of the rather unusual counterintuitive techniques that we see very commonly portrayed in the fencing treatises, but that even though they're widely agreed upon and have been common, we didn't really have necessarily data to back it up. Well, now we do. And one of these was the use of the false edge. Now, a lot of times, because we're dealing with symmetrical swords, two even edges, the hilt's more or less symmetrical, it's very difficult to tell if a lot of these weapons had a designated true and false edge. I should contextualize that just in case. So for a true edge and false edge, if you were to hold a sword up straight up like this with the edge going on like so, the edge pointing away from you towards your target is the true edge, and the edge pointing inwards towards you is generally regarded as the false edge. So if you have a symmetrical blade and a symmetrical hilt, it's hard to tell if there was a always designated true and false edge, or if it depended on simply which way the weapon was picked up. However, some of the weapons that I examined, there was one feature or another, usually some aspect of the hilt, whether it was the design, whether it could only be grasped one way. Sometimes it was a decorative feature that was on one side of the hilt, but not on the other. So that's definitely an indication that that side was meant to be facing outwards. So that meant that this sword would be drawn the same way every time. So you had a designated true edge and false edge every time. So for these, we're able to pull them aside and see if there's one, damage to both edges, and two, whether or not there seems to be any difference in these ways in the nature of these damages. And very often there was. So very frequently for these swords, you did have damage to both edges. And quite often, it tended to behave slightly differently, as you'll see with both of these examples. Falchions obviously were a lot easier to determine this since there's only one cutting edge. But you can very clearly see here instances where, for example, on the sword up above, you have some of the false edge damage to the lower part, which could be the result of either binds or defensive actions. Whereas with the very lovely Messer down below, you have the false edge damage restricted more towards the cutting edge, towards the weak, which leaves room for interpreting these as evidence of what we typically see in Messer treatises of that nice little flicky false edge cut. So it was really quite exciting and satisfying to see some of these things pop out like that, because it allows us to make a much more robust case that some of these techniques weren't just the products of these very, very esoteric treatises, but were in fact actually out in the wild being used. And the same can be said for the use of what we would refer to today as the center of percussion. So the center of percussion can more or less be referred to, I suppose, as the sweet spot on a blade. It's the spot where, because of the way everything is weighted and balanced, if you manage to land a blow there, the blade will not pivot and shunt one way or the other around this spot, but will rather carry on straight through. All of the energy will go into the cut, and it makes for a much more effective and easy on the user and on the weapon cut. It's not terribly easy to determine the spot without very, very advanced equipment. However, a friend of mine who is an engineer and a mathematician as well as a sword nerd developed a kind of cheap and cheerful way of getting in a very, very basic approximation of the spot using something that he called the wobble test. So what is the wobble test? So if we imagine a sword, if I was to hold the sword very, very loosely in my hand, not really gripping it, but allowing it to kind of move very loosely in my hand. And if I was just to make very, very light circles, I'm doing a rubbish job with a pencil, but you get the idea. It's a lot easier with a weighted sword. If you're able to make these kind of very light circles, there will be a spot around which the tip will pivot, the spot that will more or less stay more still than the rest of the blade. And that area is within mumble mumble a bit on either end, this sweet spot, the center of percussion. So it's not precise, but it gives you at least an approximation. So not surprisingly, a lot of curators weren't terribly keen on me taking 600-700-year-old weapons and doing this with them with one hand in order to get this. So I wasn't able to do this test and determine this for all of the weapons, much to my frustration. However, I was permitted to do this with some of the more robust ones. So for those, I was able to see, do we have any evidence showing that this spot was acknowledged for its usefulness? And from the data, I'd say it looks like yes, because on all of the weapons where I was able to identify the center of percussion, we don't see all of the damage around this area, but we do see a significant amount of it clustered more or less in this spot. So whether or not this was a scientifically understood concept, whether or not it was mathematically precisely understood, or whether or not it was simply something that was intuited just by having a gradual understanding of the weapon and what feels right and what doesn't. There does seem to be some appreciation that there was a sweet spot on the blade that if possible, you would try to land as many of your blows with that spot as you could manage. So after that whirlwind tour, what do we take away from it? We do see that most of the damage identified from late medieval swords tends to be restricted to the blade, and most significantly to the edges of the blade. So I'm going to stand here right now. Here I stand, I can say no other, and say that I can count on one hand the number of, half of one hand even, the number of blades that I examined that showed even the remotest scratch that could be construed as battle damage on the flat of the blade. It was 90% of the time on the edge. So that to me adds much more weight to the supposition that where at all possible, the edge was the much more preferable surface on which you would receive an incoming attack compared to the flat. Not to say it was always, but it seemed to be the much more preferable. The difference in damage between, say, long swords and arming swords and falchions as far as appearance on the guard is interesting. It tells us perhaps that guard usage might come into play a little bit more with the long sword than it does with shorter weapons. Also, the fact that we see very similar damage patterns between arming swords and falchions reinforces the notion that we see articulated by masters such as Lecoultner or Monte, that the falchion should be used in the same manner as all single-edged weapons. So it reinforces the case that arming sword and single-edged weapons such as falchions were used in a very similar manner. Also very interesting is the fact that within the 150-year period that I examined, and within the extent of geography that I covered, so this whole area of Europe, and also looking at weapons that were exceedingly high status, would have been used by people who would definitely have had access to some of these weapons, compared to much more, I suppose you could say, munitions grade or more humbler make. There was no statistically significant difference in these damage patterns. So that's not to say that there weren't difference in technique, but if there was, it's not so apparent that it shows up here. We know that sometimes it's possible to read this damage and come up with some scenarios as to what might have caused them, but these are very rare because of the sheer number of variables that we're dealing with. And then finally, it shows that what has up till now been a very underappreciated aspect of these objects is probably something that's worth a much more closer look than we've given it so far. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for that, James. That was fantastic. Very, very interesting stuff you got there. We only have, I didn't want to interrupt you. It was so great, but we only have time for a couple.
I'm sorry if I went over. Hopefully,
no, it's all right. We have time for a couple of questions, really quick questions. Terry asks if you couldn't use something like similar to forensics with trace dusting to see what type of material that the sword last came in contact with. Would that not work?
It's an interesting possibility. I didn't have the opportunity to look into that. But my concern would be when we're dealing with a lot of these weapons, I think the likelihood that that data would be contaminated is quite high, as a lot of these are coming out of having been in the ground for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then some of them also will have been in collections, so they'll have been, even if they're not aggressively conserved, they'll have been polished or conserved with different compounds and everything that could make these traces go away. So even if it were possible, I think it very unlikely with the time periods we're talking about that there'd be enough of a trace to make a solid case about that.
And then Hildo asks, how much battle damage is really from Hutton and the 19th century HEMA folks playing with what are now museum pieces? I think you sort of answered that.
Yeah, this was my greatest fear. And again, I tried as best as I could to see if I could highlight that with the using the control group weapons, and I didn't see any notable anomalies that would suggest kind of that modern damage really stood out compared to these control group ones. So either Hutton and the Victorians were actually really, really good and knew what they were doing, and so the damage is so masked that it blends in with the rest of the stuff. But the other aspect that I use to rule out is just sheer numbers. It's not impossible that some of the modern damage creeped into the data pool, but when you compare it to the overwhelming amount that I was able to catalog, the more I was able to catalog, the more that small number becomes less significant in terms of the greater analysis. So I can never stand before you and say I've purged the data pool of all of it, but I think that using the different methods that I did the best that we can manage at trying to kind of make it have as minimal of impact as possible.
And then Anton Stark asks, why did you limit yourself to Central and Northern European swords? Why not include Southern European and Eastern European swords? Was it just a question of access?
Partly access. If by Southern European, if you're referring to kind of Italy and the Mediterranean, then yes, those were. I'm perhaps being unnecessarily imprecise with my geography. I guess what I should be more specific of is say that I did not look into what we would consider Eastern European weapons on the whole, because at that time you're starting to get slight culture creep. You're getting a little bit more influence from kind of cultural influences on the kit that doesn't necessarily appear elsewhere in Europe. So I wanted to kind of have a nice, clean uniform group, which you tend to get basically west of, say, the Holy Roman Empire. It was more or less consistent.
We have time for one more question, and this is the question I'll ask you, the most important question of the conference. What is your favorite sword?
Ooh. I'm going to cite a specific object. Okay. And you can go online and look this up. Or if you happen to visit the armories in Leeds and you know someone you can get behind the scenes, you can hopefully one day maybe ask to have this put in your hand. It is, I know it off the top of my head because it was my true love while I was working up there. It is Royal Armories Class 9, Roman numeral 9, point 13. So I think it might be on the online catalog, so look it up, you'll see pictures of it. It is this little arming sword that it's an excavated condition, so it's in fairly rough shape. So it's all patinaed brown, and it was found in the 1840s when they were excavating for the foundations of the Houses of Parliament. So it was found in the Thames. So even though it's in excavated shape, it's in pretty good nick because the Thames preserves metal really well. And it's a little bit of a thing, so it's not even terribly long for an arming sword. It's quite short. But even though it's it's missing its kind of hilt wrapping and everything, so it's kind of a skeleton of a sword. You pick this thing up, and it's just yes. And it's late 14th century, roughly dated. you pick this thing up, and after 700 years, and still being in as kind of rough a shape as it is, it dances.
Oh, nice.
I just remember picking this sword up for the first time. It was like, you still speak after all this time, and you are just perfect. And it's just that one sword has always stuck with me. So whenever I would give tours behind the scenes in these, sadly this isn't on display, so you have to get access to the back collection to go see it. But I always show everyone that sword. So yes, that is my favorite sword.
All right.
It's not pretty, but my God, she's beautiful.
That's fantastic. Well, we have been talking with Dr. James Hester. Thank you very much for being with us and joining us today. It means so much for you to join us and talk about that. It was a very fascinating talk.
And I should just say, if anyone has questions, just in the interest of time, you can reach out to me on, you've got all the links and everything from the bio.
Yes.
Feel free to drop me a line if you want to talk about anything in more detail.
Yes, definitely check out his website, School of Mars. Is that correct? Is that one of your websites?
Yep, that's right.
Schoolofmars.com. It's a fantastic website. So we're going to take just a 2-minute break this time, folks, and then we're going to be back with our last session. We're going to be talking with Brittany Reeves, founder and co-lead instructor of Mordhau HEMA, and Justin Aucoin, who is an author and swordsman and friend of mine. And we'll be right back with them. So stay tuned.